Right, hello. So this talk is called Design While Shipping. This is a talk that I designed about a year ago. I've given it many times. It's very much designed for like industry people. And when I practiced, I realized, hey, this actually applies really well to anyone. So I'm really excited to share it with you today. This is 10 things that I've learned over the last 15 years about shipping. And it's not actually very much about pixels. It's not so much like the what, it's very much the how. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that's where all the success has been on my teams. Now, I split this into two chunks. We're going to talk about 5 things that have to do with opening, kicking off a process, all that blue sky stuff that's really fun. Then we're going to talk about 5 things about closing it down and shipping, because that part's really hard. One informs the other. But for me, it all starts with what I call McDonald's theory. Now, when there's a bunch of people around you and they don't know where to go to lunch, I like figuring out where they're not going to want to go, and I will say that thing. They hate that idea, and then better ideas emerge. It's kind of amazing. Now, this works at the whiteboard as well. What I do, you can literally say this. You can say, I heard of this weird technique. You just put the thing on the board that's like a really bad idea. So for this, why don't we? And you just draw a dumb thing. And then you hand the pen to someone else. And I promise, just ideas will come. Because you've broken the ice, and you looked stupid, so everyone else can feel less concerned. Now, the next thing that I do is something that I call the magic wand. I do this all the time. If anyone watches this video later, they're nodding their heads right now because I say this constantly. I say, look, what if we had a magic wand? What if we had infinite time, infinite budget, infinite devs, infinite designers? What would we do then? And it changes the way you think. There's actually brain science behind this. It changes the way you think. The goal at that point is to say, all right, well, we just described something that's 20 years away, and then you just walk it back. It's a great way to figure out what your North Star design is, just by saying, what if we had a magic wand? Now, those two techniques, McDonald's theory as well as the magic wand, all it is what this slide is saying, which is bring them with you. Imagine you're going up on a mountain, and you've got like the medic and the scientist and the photographer, and like everyone has their own specialties. But the fact is, if somebody dies before you get to the top of the mountain, then your team has failed. Designers really struggle with this. They silo themselves way too much. And it's sort of this us versus them mentality, and it doesn't work. So anything that you can do to genuinely care about the people you're working with, even the non-designers, really, really makes a big difference. And in fact, if you do that really well, you can do what I call here invading the vocabulary. By the way, as a side note, these slides are done by my friend Susan Lin. I love having watercolor up here. Invading the vocabulary, this was her perspective on that, which I loved. It just means like understand your audience, understand who you're talking to. Not everyone understands the jargon that you're getting in the design world. So when you're talking with engineers, like it helps to just like do your best to try to understand where you are. Now, my favorite example of this is a friend of mine. He was a design lead on a team, and he realized, look, I want to make sure these design principles are heard and understood. So he went and he talked to the leads of engineering, PM, marketing, et cetera. They had some brainstorms, they worked on it, they talked about it, and they came up with some core principles together. It did not come from on high, from some designer writing an email. That never works. They came up with them together. And then in the bug tracking software, it always has like priority, severity, description. They actually added a column for core principles. And he realized that this was successful not when he was lecturing people about it, but when engineers would talk to each other about it. That was the win. He invaded that bug tracking software and got those design principles in there, which is great. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of opening, how to open well, is this, fidelity. I think the #1 problem I've seen in my 15 years in technology, designers jump into Photoshop too fast, or Illustrator, or whatever you're working in. I don't know what happened, but this is just a thing that happens way too much. Look, in this example, these are two people talking. A sketch opens a conversation. A sketch is polite. It is generous. It is kind. It's like a giant question mark. You go, how about this? And then someone else says something. When you go to high fidelity too quickly, you're sort of shutting down the conversation. Or people ask why you put Latin text in your mock, and you have to talk about that for a while. So staying in low fidelity has been my secret weapon for 15 years. I'm very much known as the guy that does sketches like this, because it makes me look humble, and it makes me look like I want to know what you are saying, and it makes a much better conversation. Now let's talk about closing. Closing is very disappointing for everybody, because the magic wand is gone. All the dreams have been shattered, and you're going to ship something that you're probably not as excited about as you started out being. So getting through closing is really hard. And at Frog, I had a reputation for being really good at closing, which basically just means that I can kill my babies. Like, I just know, like, look, that's the deadline. We're going to ship this. So I've learned some techniques. And the first one is use the right fidelity, which might be kind of weird because they're like, hey, John, you just totally talked about fidelity a second ago. Why are we still talking about fidelity? Well, you'll notice in this case, they're not just looking at a blueprint. There's a skyscraper, and they're high-fiving, which I think is a nice touch. You need to learn public speaking and or enough code to get by and or persuasion skills in order to land your designs. This is, I don't know, again, I don't know what the deal is, but if you imagine down here is like very simple napkin sketches, and way up here is a Steve Jobs keynote, too many designers are just kind of right in the middle. And you're not going to impress the executive team by turning on layers and disabling and enabling layers of Photoshop while they look over your shoulder. You need to be able to bring it. And if you can bring it at the end of a process, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. Because all the people on the fence, if you go and you just nail them with a good presentation, the people on the fence, the safe thing is to agree with you. Hooray! Now, some people will still disagree with you, and that's great. That's a great conversation to have. But don't make them disagree with you because you weren't prepared. It's very important to come with high fidelity at the end of a project. Number 6, the second one for closing. I call this bite your tongue. I'm bad at this. I'm very bad at this, but great products come from great teams, and great teams come from great relationships. If you are making fun of engineering, or you are making fun of marketing, or you're hating on your executive team, whatever, we all do it, but it is eroding the quality of your eventual product because you are eroding the relationships. We say that people are the most important thing, and that's wrong. If you get a jerk on your team, tell me how that goes. Relationships are what make this work, and that's why if you're struggling with something, you need to go talk about it, or your product will suffer. Now, something that I use when I'm in a situation where people are disagreeing and we're trying to find our way forward, I just try to remember trade-offs. Everything is a trade-off. Your favorite design is full of trade-offs. This idea that there is such a thing as a right design is just false. There's no such thing as the right design. There's only trade-offs, and the one that you like the most is the one that picked the trade-offs that you like. So I like to look at the humble tugboat. If somebody were to say, is this a good boat? I'd say, oh, I don't have enough information. What's the problem you're trying to solve? We all are taught this as designers. Figure out the problem you're trying to solve, but then we forget it. So this tugboat is amazing at pulling stuff. So in that case, it's good. It's really bad at going fast. So in that case, it's bad. And you'll find that a lot in design. When people say, John, I don't like your design, I say, OK, fine, why? I try not to take it personally. I try to figure out, oh, they're concerned it's going to take too long. Or, oh, they were optimizing for fewer taps, but I was optimizing for more things at once, or whatever. Frame things as trade-offs, not right and wrong, and you'll be a lot easier to work with. Now, a technique, I used to work with Jeremy Bowen, the guy, one of the people just giving the talk, and something that the head of that studio likes to talk about is push it till it breaks. So this is a technique where people have been fighting for 3 months on this thing. We can't come to resolution. We just all disagree. And I love those situations. We sometimes refer to them as a 51-49 because it's a toss-up. Even if you believe that one way is better, it's not so much better that it's obvious, or else you would have resolved it already. So when you find yourself in that situation, what I've found is print out all the implications of doing one approach, and then print out all the implications of doing the other approach. And then pitch this one as hard as you can, and then pitch this one as hard as you can, and your whole team is there, and then shut up. And the reason for that shutting up is, look, if it goes your way and you end up winning, quote unquote, you did it without burning bridges and throwing a giant hissy fit, which designers have a bad reputation about, which is great. But if you lose, quote unquote, just remember, this really was more of a toss-up. That's why all these smart people couldn't agree on it. So looking like you have a little bit of grace in that moment is worth way more than but Steve Jobs told me to argue more. So it's really, really valuable. Now the last one I want to talk about here of the group of 10 is what I call braiding. And that story from earlier about the pig in the boat and all that really reminded me of this. There's a book called Quiet. It's about introverts. And in that book, they have a whole bunch of great data, but some of it is that brainstorms don't actually work. They are optimized for the loudest, most experienced, usually a dude, person in the room. And what they found is that in a brainstorm, if you get a bunch of people to write out their thoughts beforehand on their own, singular, then the brainstorm is much better. And I use this in a whole bunch of ways. Some ways that I use it is I block out my calendar, whole chunks, like 4 hours. You cannot take this time. Or when I get thrown onto a new project, people are like, hey, let's all get on the same page. And I'll say, actually, before I get on the same page with you, because this is a team that's been working on it for a while, give me 3 days to think about this on my own. Now, the reason I bring this up in the second part of my talk, the sort of closing part, is when you're about to release software, stuff gets very agitated sometimes. There's a lot of just frustration and I don't know if we're going to hit the date. People start freaking out more and more, and that's why it's even more important to take some time. There's a great line that says you need to meditate, and if you don't have time to meditate, you have to meditate twice as long. There's kind of a weird contradiction there, but that's the same thing when you're trying to ship. You need to take time for yourself so you know what you actually think, and then you'll be much better in meetings. Now, the reason I call this braiding. Things are apart, and then they're together, and apart again. If you do that through a process, it's actually way better. So these are the 10 things I just talked about. And when I put this talk together about a year ago, I thought this talk was going to be called Design Courage, because I was like, courage, 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 courage. But the more I thought about the word courage, the more it just didn't seem quite right. What I realized, actually, is I was talking about the courage to be wrong and the courage to not always get your way, the courage to ask engineers their opinions about designs or invite them to design crit, the horror. What I realized, actually, is, yeah, I'm talking about courage, but I'm talking about a special kind of courage, and that's humility. We don't have a lot of humility in the tech world, and I think that's a problem. We talk instead about rock stars. The thing is, if you study rock stars and you really think through this metaphor of rock star, they are like the anti-hero. Like, you don't want to be like that. The Beatles were not amazing because of any one of these 4 men. The Beatles were amazing because of this, the relationships between them. Because if you take any 4 people and you count the number of relationships between any 4 people, you get 6. When the Beatles were amazing, it's because this was healthy. And when the Beatles had to break up, it's because this had gone sour. That was the big difference. It wasn't that they forgot how to be rock stars, or they forgot how to play their instruments or how to write lyrics. They forgot how to be kind to one another, and they forgot how to collaborate. Now, this is not a surprise to anyone that's ever played sports, because if you're on a team, let's say you're on a soccer team, there's 12 people on the team. Once the soccer team gets to a certain level of competence, where you can assume that no one's going to shoot on their own goal by accident, and you're at this core level, at that point, that next level that you get to is how well your team can read each other's mind and how selfless the team can be. For example, I was on teams where the person getting ready to score a goal, all they had to do was pass, and they'd get a goal. But they didn't want to, because they wanted the goal. That made it for a worse team. And so think about being on a team working with 11 other people for a total of 12. Whether it's a soccer team or it's your software team, let's do the same math. If you have 12 people and you count the connections between them, you get 66 connections. So anyone here in this room that's already working on a team, you probably have this or more relationships to deal with. So when you hire someone onto the team that's maybe a rock star, they were on the cover of Fast Company, this is going to go great. Well, if they show up on your team and they don't know how to work with others, you've just gotten 1 person and 11 bad relationships. And that's the kind of thing that can mess up a team. So I think it's important to kind of zoom out a little bit and realize, in tech, in Silicon Valley, but also when you're thinking about yourself, of course you need core skills. Of course learn all the tools that we're all using. Of course, get all these core competencies where they need to be. But don't forget that one core competency is being a good person. Being the kind of person that people can rely on, who's not going to throw a giant hissy fit when things don't go well, the kind of person who's gracious and kind and tries to catalyze growth and opportunities and excitement in other people, not always hogging the spotlight, all that. I've found that all the best software comes from this. I've worked with so many people that you have never heard of because they're not famous, but those were some of the best teams because we were all in it for each other. So I've realized over the last 15 years of my career and in this talk, I can actually kind of sum all this up with just the word humility. So I want to leave you with one last quote. It's from Maya Angelou, and it really does apply to everything. And think about this when you're designing. No one remembers what you said. No one remembers what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Thank you very much.